set in forest reserves and national parks than probably any other president since. Roosevelt was very much of this generation that saw nature as an antidote to civilization.
And in coming to East Africa, I think that it was part of his effort to recapture that long-gone pioneer spirit. He was this great open landscape, very few people, and he had a whale of a time over that period of a year.
Immediately, the great American conservationist set out doing what conservationists in those days did: hunt.
Roosevelt just lined up with specimens. This is the ultimate He-Man, sort of big hunter image.
But as his lust for the primitive urges of the hunt propelled him on, Africa started to stir deep emotions for an age lost to the modern world.
When I went to Serengeti for the first time and saw all those wildebeest, the first thought that came into my head was, this is what the American West must have looked like before we destroyed all the bison. So I think when someone like Roosevelt saw all this game running around, he was like, oh, we have a second chance here. You know, it hasn't all been squandered, it's still here.
Here was a last, primordial wilderness that urgently needed preservation. Atonement for the losses of the civilized world.
All civilized governments are now realizing that it is their duty here and there to preserve unharmed tracts of wild nature, with thereon the wild things, the destruction of which means the destruction of half the charm of wild nature.
And that's certainly a big part of how conservation in East Africa is talked about. It's like something to be protected for all of humanity because it's unique and special now, because this is a place where it hasn't been destroyed. And therefore, this is the place that we should be especially concerned about, right?
On his return, however, Roosevelt's adoring public were captivated not by fledgling thoughts of global conservation, but by the heroic exploits of the great white hunter.
Roosevelt's 1911 safari really created a cascade of hunters coming out.
In East Africa, the British colonial government's initial reaction to controlling this slaughter was to create hunting licenses. But in a place as big as this, with just a handful of administrators, their power to actually control anything was severely limited. Licenses were much more effective against the local people.
With one fell swoop, native hunting became illegal because not many natives could go to the towns, the colonial towns, the colonial bombers where the colonial administrators were, to obtain hunting licenses. So the only form of hunting that then became legal was European hunting.
So there was this complete divide between the trophy hunting colonials and, if you like, the subsistence hunters trying to get at those same animals for meat. And the local populations felt very alienated that wildlife had become not their customary right, but it had become something of a sport, something of a pleasure for the colonial government. So again, that became a deep antagonism.
As traditional hunters were branded poachers, hunting and the safari now became the noble pursuit of foreign dignitaries and kings, like the future George VI. But very soon, wild Africa would be available to all, with the invention of the portable movie camera. Martin and Orsa Johnson were among the first to lay down their guns and pick up a camera, for some of the time at least.
On the trail, Orsa's eye suddenly catches a slinking figure ahead. A lion has caught the scent of his favorite delicacy, zebra. While he stalks his prey, guns are dropped, cameras take their place, and Martin starts photographing the action. In a flash,
They spent a couple years in Africa filming wild animals. And part of it very much conformed to a vision of Africa of ecological paradise. They talk about this place that they discovered, Lake Paradise, well, they of course hadn't discovered it. It had been known by the African people around that area for a long time. They very much portray it as this Garden of Eden.
Through the camera lens, the animals of Africa took on new meaning. Transformed by technology, from savage beasts to things of extraordinary beauty. And the Johnsons were the first to film from the air.
Aerial scenes becomes very important because it's a kind of God's eye view of the world, if you will, and portrays the immensity of the landscape.
Wildebeest, hundreds upon hundreds of wildebeest, led on by overpowering thirst, driven on by the lions that follow.
If you're filming wildebeest migration, you begin to capture the awe of the sheer scale and size of these wildlife populations.
Though still in black and white, these extraordinary scenes from the early 1930s show a surprisingly familiar image of Africa emerging, one that we can recognize in wildlife films today. Roosevelt's savage primordial wilderness was evolving into a land of awe-inspiring, majestic beauty. Even if, ultimately, the audience's need for thrills and spills required every scene to climax with a large dose of false jeopardy and end up with Ossa shooting the main subject.
Ossa lets go another bullet. And Ossa Johnson has scored the first lion kill of her life.
But attitudes were beginning to change, and soon a few of the more enlightened hunters began to see the impending end of what had once seemed endless, even in the vast expanses of Serengeti.
There was almost no control of this hunting. It was a free-for-all. And there was, on some occasions, as many as 100 lions were shot in one trip. This enraged some of the more conscientious professional hunters, one of which, Finch Hatton, who features in Out of Africa. He wrote a letter to the Times complaining and saying that there has to be regulation.
And what shall one say of the two gentlemen who went to the Serengeti by motorcar and killed between them 80 lions? Can we think of anything more nauseating? And this is considered sport.
The last of the great hunters actually ended up in southern Tanzania, where I grew up. People like Rushby and many others. And they had been the great elephant hunters of the 1920s. That whole era came to an end in the 1930s. And ironically, they became the first game wardens. They switched from seeing wildlife as endless to realizing that, in fact, this was not an endless resource. It was coming to an end, and it was coming to an end very quickly.
Over the following decades, it became clear to these early hunter-turned conservationists